In this PowerPoint presentation, we'll be looking at the two letters Titus and Philemon, and they're not necessarily related, but they were written about the same time and from the same person, so we're going to treat them together here in this PowerPoint. Titus was the third of the pastoral epistles. Actually, it was probably written earlier than 2 Timothy, maybe even earlier than 1 Timothy, probably around the same time as 1 Timothy. 1 and 2 Timothy were grouped together because they're to the same recipient. But Titus was written and has some similar things as you might imagine, since Paul is once again telling a follower, a disciple, how to be an effective pastor. Probably written around 63 AD, and the purpose was to instruct Titus on the need for leadership and order in a newly planted church on the island of Crete. Now that's not one of the places we have record of Paul attending, so Paul is actually telling him how to lead a church in a place he doesn't know, whereas Timothy was pastoring a church that Paul had helped to found. The key themes on that include qualifications for the elders, very similar to what we found in 1 Timothy, God's grace for the transformation of a new believer, and the centrality of the gospel and all the things that Titus is going to be doing. The general outline for Titus is this, that there's a greeting, like all of Paul's letters, a salutation. Then there's an appointment of elders and the qualifications for what it means to be an elder there. And then putting all things in order. And putting all things in order, he talks about guarding against false teachers. He gives ethical instructions within the church. And then ethical instructions for how the church is to live within the world. And it's always a complex thing. We're part of the world, but not part of the world. At the same time, we're in the world, but not of the world, is what Jesus said. And so Paul says, well, this isn't easy. It's a little tricky. This is how you do it. And so he's giving him some important, necessary instruction. He then gives some final instructions and a benediction. So you see his letter to Titus is very similar to that of Timothy. It doesn't have the personal ring to it, though, because he probably wasn't as close to Timothy as he was to Titus. Excuse me, he wasn't as close to Titus as he was to Timothy. Philemon was a gentleman that we assume the Apostle Paul knew, who was a wealthy man, and who obviously had some slaves. And one of his slaves had become a Christian, and now so had Philemon. And it changed the situation, so Paul is writing him a letter to teach him, to tell him how to treat this slave. What had happened is the slave Onesimus had run away from Philemon. He didn't want to be a slave anymore, and somehow he ended up in the company of Paul. Now Paul is convincing him, well, as long as this worldly institution remains, you do have a responsibility to obey your master, and he's going to send him back to Philemon. But with Onesimus, he's sending a letter that tells Philemon that you need to treat him differently now. Now that you're a Christian, the concept of being a slave master should be radically different. In fact, you ought to treat him as a brother, and indicates it would be best to set him free. So it's an idea there that the Apostle Paul is bringing equality in a world where there was great inequality among people, and showing that the Christian message was supposed to change the social structure even at that time. This is an important book. It's in the United States. Whenever the issue of slavery came up, it was often touted. Some that supported slavery said, oh, well, Paul allowed slavery to exist, and others were saying, no, he's critical of it, and was saying that it needs to bring equality to all people, that the gospel changes the status of people, and I think that that is probably a more accurate translation of it. The author of it was clearly Paul. He says so in verse 1. Probably around 60 AD. He was in prison, perhaps in Rome already at this point, and he addresses it to Philemon, Apphia, Archippus, and the church in your house. So it's an entire group of people, but it takes the name of probably the most important member of that, Philemon. And the purpose is to appeal for Onesimus on the result of his return from having run away. As you might imagine, this book does a lot with relationships. And so the key themes include relationships that are changed by the gospel, that the gospel changes the way in which we look at and relate to others. He then goes on and talks about the importance of forgiveness. Forgiving any wrong that Onesimus may have done prior to leaving, but especially now that he's returning, for the fact that he had left. And then he talks about we are motivated by grace, and that this grace then changes how we treat other people around us, even in our existing relationships and in our new changed ones as well. The outline for Philemon is simply a very simple one. It's a very short book. It's only one chapter. There's a greeting followed by thanksgiving. So Philemon must have had some good qualities, because Paul's raising them there in verses 4 through 7. And then he pleads for the most of the letter for Onesimus, in which he says, he spoke of the return of Onesimus. We introduced this character. We don't know who he is before. He talks about how he's of great value to Paul. And Paul's saying to Philemon, this is a real brother. He's done a lot of good things. And then he's suggesting that Onesimus should be freed. And whether Paul is making a categorized statement against slavery at this point is probably not clear, but he is indicating in other passages in Galatians that there is neither Jew nor Greek, nor master nor slave, and so he's advocating that, it seems. He then talks about Philemon's reception of Onesimus on the basis that Paul is a co-signer for Onesimus. In other words, he has the authority to tell Philemon, hey, he's my slave too, but a different kind of slave. He's a slave in Christ. He's a brother in Christ. He's a servant in the Lord, not a physical slave. So he says, based on that authority, I'm asking you to receive him. And then he's also saying that Paul himself is a guest of Philemon, that he hopes to see Philemon one day. He's appealing to Philemon on the basis that Philemon actually owes a lot to Paul, and that's his faith. And then finally he has some final greetings. So we see a very personal letter in both of these letters from Paul to two different individuals.